Greetings! Some of you have been keeping up with the news and you're aware of the political problems going on in Israel today. Back in the 1960s, there was a story going around that the Prime Minister of Israel had been speaking with President Lyndon Baines Johnson in the United States. President Johnson told the Prime Minister, "How would you like to run a country of 180 million people?" And the Prime Minister said, "How would you like to run a country with 2 million prime ministers?" That's the way it seems to be in Israel. You know, the Jews are descendants of Abraham, as are the Arabs. And recently, there have been agreements between various Muslim states and Arab states with Israel, and they went over under the general term Abraham Accords. We hear about the Abrahamic religions, the three great monotheistic religions: Judaism, later Christianity, and then later Islam. We who are Christians are, spiritually speaking, of the seed of Abraham in the spiritual sense. In the book of Romans, he's called the father of all those who believe, the father of us all. And of course, it is through Abraham that we have the covenants that lead to the new covenant. In James 2 and verse 23, we're told this about Abraham. And the scriptures was fulfilled, which says, Abraham believed God, and it was accounted to him for righteousness. Of course, quoting Genesis 15. But let's go further. And he was called the friend of God. So Abraham was the friend of God. And God, in a special way, visited Abraham. I want to talk about that today. Lessons from a divine visit. Now, I'm not going to be probably able to go through all of them. And there are probably some that maybe I've overlooked too, that I'll discover in further study or as I get input from others. But I want to go to Isaiah 41, and today I want to talk about lessons from a divine visit. In Isaiah 41 and verse 8, I'm in 40, I need to be in 41. 41 and verse 8, "But you, Israel, are my servant, Jacob, whom I have chosen, the descendants of Abraham, my friend." So Abraham is foundational to God's way of life, to the covenant, you could say, to Christianity. In verse 51, when speaking to Israel, which was the church of God in ancient times under the covenant at Sinai, listen to me, in Isaiah 51, "Listen to me, you who follow after righteousness, you who see the eternal. Look to the rock from which you were hewn, and to the hole of the pit from which you were dug." So what is the foundation? Abraham and Sarah. They're the sort of the first couple of the church in that sense. "Look to Abraham your father and to Sarah who bore you, for I called him alone and blessed him and increased him." Now, one of the wonderful things about being a friend of God is he's going to share information with a friend that he wouldn't necessarily share with someone else. Now, how do you define a friend of God? We'll see that in just a moment. Let's see what Jesus Christ says in John 15 to those who are truly his followers, what we might call in a generic sense the disciples of Christ. In John 15 and verse 15, Jesus says, "No longer do I call you servants, for a servant does not know what his master is doing. But I have called you friends, for all things that I heard from my Father, I have made known to you." So how is a friend defined, a friend of Jesus Christ? In the prior verse 14, he says, "You are my friends if you do whatever I command you." So if we are Christian commandment keepers in the generic sense, if we are Christian commandment keepers, then we're going to know more than others about what God is doing. there are prophecies that frankly puzzle me, and I think puzzle others if they're honest about it, objective about it, if they don't try to just force answers. There are certain prophecies that I believe generally we cannot quite yet explain. And I believe as we get closer to the time when we need to know about them, that we will. Some prophecies were not even understood by Christ's apostles until in retrospect they look back and understood. But there are some that are important to know ahead of time. I believe as I believe that if we are friends of Jesus Christ, as we get closer to those events, we'll know more clearly what we need to know. And we'll see that as we come to this section where God visits Abraham. Now, first, I want to go to the Gospel of John. We understand that ultimately God became one of us. That is incredible. What a power-packed statement. The incarnation, right? The greatest of the miracles. John 1:1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him nothing made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. Verse 14. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. But he prepared us for that historically. And in Acts 7, Stephen tried to get that point across to the Jewish people in his day. He tried. And if somebody came to me with that kind of background, as I had that background, I would say one of the best ways to understand the nature of God and the nature of Jesus Christ is to go through the material in Acts 7. And what we see is that through the days of the Old Testament, particularly when you get back to the foundational times, to the patriarchs and Moses and Joshua, those the fundamental Bible heroes, you could say, we have God appearing in a man-like way. Well, he also appeared, interestingly enough, in the first case of that, to an Egyptian servant, a woman, Hagar. But even before that, of course, our first parents, Adam and Eve, their relationship with God was such that he appeared before them in a man-like way. So through the patriarchs and through Jacob wrestled with him, and then later on Joshua is confronted by him before Jericho falls. We have these theophanies where we have a God appearing in a man-like way. Now, evidently, when he appeared as a man, but yet as a man who was a supernatural man, that it was recognized by those whom he confronted, that this was God revealing himself to them in that way. And it was terrifying, but at the same time, very ultimately very inspiring. So this happened in Old Testament times. What we have here is the pre-incarnate Jesus Christ, but he's preparing us for what he ultimately would do. So in Genesis 18, he comes as a man, and two men are with him, and they are angels who accompany him, and then they go on to Sodom, and to deal with Lot. We have this concept that the two witnesses, they go to Lot and rescue Lot, and we won't deal with that today, but we're leading up to it in Genesis 18. Then the Eternal appeared to him by the terebinth trees of Mamre as he was sitting in the tent door in the heat of the day. Now he evidently, if you go back to Genesis 17, he's circumcised, and evidently that's on the day which became the first day of unleavened bread. So we're very likely within the days of unleavened bread in this account. And even in Genesis 19, that's implied. Let me just show you what happens in Genesis 19. I want to find the reference where he verse 3. But this is where the two angels come to Lot's place. But he insisted strongly, so they turned into him and entered the house. Then they made them a feast and baked them unleavened bread, and they ate. So the implication here is that, this happened at the time that later would become the festival of unleavened bread, that season. So anyway, here we have that season, and they're coming to Abraham, and the Eternal appears to Abraham while he's recovering from the circumcision. So he lifted his eyes and looked, and behold, 3 men were standing by him. And when he saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet them and bowed himself to the ground. Now the Jews have a way of spinning this so that these are 3 angels. I don't want to go into how they do it, because you just read it. It's very clear if you don't play games with it what's going on here. God appears to Abraham, and he sees 3 men, and one of them is actually God in the form of a man, and you see that from the way he talks here. When he saw them, he ran from the door to meet them and bowed himself to the ground, and he said, "My Lord." And this is really the very respectful term. I believe here it's really Adonai. So it's the majestic plural. He's talking to God. "My Lord, if I have now found favor in your sight, do not pass on by your servant." And this is the verbs the pronoun is in the singular. Your servant. Probably the Old King James says thy servant. It's singular there because he's speaking to God. The 2 men are there, but he's focusing, of course, on God. Please, so there's 3 men, one of them being Yahweh, as Adonai, Hashem, the Lord, the Eternal. "Please let a little water be brought and wash your face and rest yourself under the tree." So they're resting under the tree. "And I will bring a morsel of bread that you may refresh your hearts and that you may pass by, inasmuch as you have come to your servant." They said, "Do as you have said." Let's go back to verse 4. I skipped over something. "Please let a little water be brought and wash your feet and rest yourselves under the tree." Yeah. You see the imagery here projects far into the future. Here we have sitting under the tree, and Jesus Christ, in a sense, was crucified on a tree. And before that happened, he washed the feet of 12 descendants of Abraham. Here, Abraham washes God's feet, and later on, God washes the feet of 12 descendants of Abraham. And then he bring a morsel of bread. Well, if you see later, he tells Sarah, prepare ugot, prepare cakes. I suspect that if you prepare them in a hurry, they're unleavened. So they're having unleavened products here, I would say. I speculate speculatively, because it's all done in such a hurry. So you see the foreshadowing here. At least I do. "And I will bring a morsel of bread that you may refresh your hearts. After that you may pass by, inasmuch as you have come to your servant." They said, "Do as you have said." So it's interesting that he's very respectful. He's very much in awe. He realizes, I remember in a Star Trek movie where they thought they had come to God. Of course, it turned out to be a fraud. But anyway, Captain Kirk makes this comment when they're about to visit this creature. He says, "God is a busy man," jokingly. But the point is that, here we have God visiting him, and so he figures, well, I'm not necessarily worthy of an extended visit, but at least he came. So I'm grateful he came. I'll treasure the moment that he's here, but then he may pass on. Well, he did stay long enough to have a lot to say to Abraham. They had a very nice discussion, as you'll see, if we have time. "So Abraham hurried into the tent of Sarah and said, 'Quickly, make ready 3 measures of fine meal, knead it, and make cakes.'" Abraham is looked upon by the Jews as an example of hospitality. It's an important part of Middle Eastern culture, an important part of Jewish culture, an important part of Arab culture, the welcoming of the stranger, the hospitality. If you come into a home of a Mediterranean family, probably Greeks, Italians, Jews, Arabs, if you come into their home, they're going to offer you food and drink, and rather than offend them, at least have a glass of water. Don't just say, "I don't want anything," because you're going to hurt their feelings. So ask at least for a glass of water, if nothing else. Anyway, and Abraham ran to the herd, took a tender and good calf, gave it to a young man, and he hastened to prepare it. So he took butter and milk and the calf which he had prepared and set it before them, and he stood by them under the tree as they ate. And you're so innocent that this doesn't bother you at all. This doesn't challenge you at all. But an Orthodox Jew is challenged by this because the rabbis have come up with a very complicated system where where based upon a verse saying you shouldn't cook a baby goat in its mother's milk. All right, that's for whatever reason it's forbidden. In fact, it's 3 times it's forbidden. So whatever you want to make of it, but the rabbis really made a lot out of it. That they said you could not have milk and dairy mixed at all. And you could not have, for example, a cheeseburger. You couldn't have bread and butter with meat. They extended it to fowl as well. And then they said that if you eat meat, you have to wait quite a while for it to digest before you have milk. So what do they do with this passage? Well, there's 2 answers they give. One is it's before the law was given at Sinai. But another excuse, which I think is kind of an excuse, if you with all due respect, is that they say, well, the butter and milk are mentioned first. And what Jews will do is if they have dairy, they don't have to wait so long before they have meat. I guess because dairy is evidently digested rather quickly. So if they have dairy, they can have meat afterwards, but the other way around, no. But so, as I said, this gives them an out that maybe he was keeping the dietary laws that the rabbis instituted by putting out the dairy first and then the meat. What can I tell you? But anyway, let's go to verse 9. Then they said to him, "Where is Sarah, your wife?" So he said, "Here in the tent." So obviously God knows where she is, but he's focusing on Sarah. The visit here is for Sarah. Poor Sarah. She's too old to have a child now. She wanted a child. Abraham wanted a child by Sarah, and now she's too old for that. And yet the visit is for Sarah to tell her, evidently by saying she's in the tent, it means she's within earshot of what God is about to say. And he doesn't call her out. Maybe he didn't want her to feel awkward by calling her out, so he says it so she can hear it. And he said, "I will certainly return to you according to the time of life, and behold, Sarah your wife shall have a son." Sarah was listening in the tent door that was behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, well advanced in age, and Sarah had passed the age of childbearing. So she was 90 when Isaac was born. Therefore Sarah laughed within herself, saying, "After I have grown old, shall I have pleasure, my Lord being old also?" And the Eternal said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh, saying, 'Shall I surely bear a child since I am old?'" Now she didn't, I guess, laugh out loud, but she laughed within herself. She was thinking, that this can't be. This must be something humorous. Can't really be true. And this is an important point to remember, that Isaac was born miraculously. I mean, you have roughly speaking, you have 100-year-old Abraham, 90-year-old Sarah, and now you have a child born. Now Jesus is born miraculously, a virgin birth. That's a great miracle. But Isaac was born miraculously as a type of Jesus Christ. He's in many ways a type of Christ. He has just one wife, Rebecca, his whole life, and he is almost sacrificed, and he is in effect metaphorically resurrected, and so forth. So he's very much a type of Christ, Isaac. Anyway, is anything too hard for the Eternal? At the appointed time, I'll return to you according to the time of life, and Sarah shall have a son. So during the days of unleavened bread, evidently. But Sarah denied it, saying, "I did not laugh," for she was afraid. So she didn't, she didn't really just burst out laughing, but within herself she did. But she's trying, but she's fearful, obviously. So, you're trying to get out from under the problem. And he said, "No, but you did laugh." But he didn't punish her for it because it was more of an inner thought, And obviously she can be excused for that. A woman that old having a baby, and a man that old begetting a baby, you could understand the surprise. But he had promised God had promised Abraham that it is going to be through Sarah that this covenant is going to continue. So he made a promise, and he's going to fulfill that promise. Now, I remember speaking to a very beloved teacher of mine, an evangelist who no longer is with us. And I said to him, it's just amazing to me how there could ever really be, a work, a church of God, an authentic Christian commandment keeping community, however I put it, among in a large, significant way among the Jewish people. However, the Bible does indicate that's going to be the case. It seems to me that when Jesus says, "Let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains," when the abomination happens, somebody's going to have to read, be there to read that and flee. So anyway, I was saying to this minister, the years have gone by, and I don't see really a truly authentic, what's the right, gospel believing, gospel practicing, community within Jewry. And so he in effect told me, Abraham had to wait a long time, before Isaac was born. God made a promise; He's going to keep the promise. Well, anyway, let's go on. And the Eternal said, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I'm doing?" Okay, let's go to verse 16. Then the men rose from there and looked toward Sodom, and Abraham went with them to send them on the way. So again, the hospitality concept: you escort them out, and then send them on their way. And the Eternal said, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I'm doing?" Isn't that wonderful? If you have that kind of relationship with God, He's going to let you know ahead of time significant events that are going to affect you. And, we have prophecy in the Bible for, God is letting us know ahead of time what's going to happen. And in the case of Abraham, he had a nephew there, he had family there that were going to be impacted by what was going to happen. And these were people who lived nearby in any case. So he was going to be affected by this event. Then the man rose from, let's go to verse 17. And the Eternal said, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I am doing? Since Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him." This is really a side point, getting off on a detour. But last week I was talking about composers who had a Jewish background, and I mentioned Oscar Hammerstein, and evidently I think he had one Jewish parent. Richard Rogers, who worked with him, I think had two. And it is interesting that over the years, Jews have had talent, so in one sense it has given them praise, as the Bible prophesied. Judah means praise, and so the house of Judah has had talent and has been praised, but at the same time there's a problem of envy that you see in Isaiah 11. So you have praise on the one hand and then envy, which leads to persecution on the other. And so at least one branch of the family of Abraham, the house of Judah, has had that problem. Anyway, let's go back to the text. And the Eternal said, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I am doing? Since Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him," ultimately through the Messiah, through Jesus Christ, who was a descendant of David, a descendant of Judah, a descendant of Abraham, and so on. "For I have known him," this is very important, Abraham, a friend of God, was the kind of person who would pass on his values, not only to his children, but to his grandchildren. Now, right now, Linda and I have had 50 years together, and we have at this point 3 grandsons. There's another grandson due in August, and there's another grandchild due in November. We don't yet know the gender, so we have that responsibility now of passing on values, not only to our children but now to grandchildren. And here's what he says in 19th verse: For I have known him in order that he may command his children and his household after him, that they keep the way of the Eternal, to do righteousness and justice, that the Eternal may bring to Abraham what he has spoken to him. that he may command his children and his household after him, that they keep the way of the Eternal to do righteousness and justice, that the Eternal may bring to Abraham what he has spoken to him. And so because he was that kind of person, who would pass on his values to the next generation and generations, plural, God was going to now reveal to him what was going to happen to Sodom and Gomorrah. But what's interesting is Abraham's reaction. Abraham's reaction was, please spare the city. There's got to be enough righteous people there to spare the city. And he even negotiates down to 10. If there are 10 people in those cities that are righteous, God said, all right, I will spare the city even for the sake of those 10. He doesn't say, please spare my family. He says, please spare the city for the sake of those 10 people. This is a quality of mercy. And you see that in the case of Moses, when God says to Moses, stand back and I'll destroy this nation and build a nation from you. He doesn't say, yeah, all right, go, have at it. No. And he doesn't even respectfully say, well, you know best, I'll just back off. He pleads for them, and God says, all right, I'm not going to wipe them out. That seems to be the test for Moses, what his attitude is going to be. And this is in a way a test for Abraham. And Abraham acts as Moses does later. No, don't destroy them. If there's some possibility of not doing it. I want to go to Luke, the 9th chapter. And this reflects the personality of some of us. And it shows why we have to be very, very careful, and make sure that we have the proper character so that God ultimately can make of us kings and priests and judges in his kingdom. You want to go to Luke 9 and verse 54. When the Samaritans rejected the Jesus and his people from coming through their area because he was on his way to Jerusalem, verse 54 of Luke 9. And when the disciples, James and John, saw this, they said, Lord, do you want us to command fire to come down from heaven and consume them just as Elijah did? No, that's not the way we should react. We should react, forgive them for they know not what they do. Or as Stephen said, don't lay this into their charge there when he was martyred. But he turned and rebuked them and said, you do not know what manner of spirit you are of. For the Son of Man did not come to destroy men's lives, but to save them. And they went to another village. So Abraham had this quality of mercy. And if there are enough righteous people, would you spare the city for those righteous people? And he said that he would. Now it's interesting also how careful he is, how respectful he is, because he's having a discussion with God, and he keeps it the proper perspective. This is the Almighty God, omniscient, right? Omnipresent, omnipotent, omnibeneficent, eternal. So he keeps his level of respect. In the case of Job kind of went over the edge and in effect accused God of not being fair, and so finally he had to repent of that. And I'm going to go to Job 42 and verse 6. Here Abraham is challenging, or he's challenged, and therefore he's challenging God in this discussion, but he doesn't quite go as much over the edge as Job did, although Job ultimately remained faithful. He never sinned in any of this, so he's called patient in the New Testament. But in Job 42:5, Job says to God, I've heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Therefore I abhor myself and repent in dust and ashes. So he realizes he had gone over the edge there in his accusations. Abraham is challenging the decision, but yet very respectfully. And I wanted to look into that in some of these terms that we see here. Let's go first to verse 24, or even earlier to verse 22. All right, Genesis 18:22. Then the men turned away from there and went towards Sodom, but Abraham still stood before the Eternal. In the Jewish tradition, they say that the text originally said, the Eternal yet stood before Abraham. In other words, these two men went on, the angels, but God, in the form of a man, Yahweh, still stood before Abraham. And evidently this was so anthropomorphic that the Jews decided that they wanted to change it. The original text is preserved. The Jewish tradition is that it was changed to what we have. Some modern translations have gone back to what the Jews say is the original version. And again, you see, the Jews are avoiding the issue of the fact that God at times appeared in man-like form to the patriarchs. And this was a prelude to what he ultimately did when he became one of us, which, of course, is something unacceptable to Judaism and Islam, the very revolutionary concept of the incarnation and then all the rest that follows, the crucifixion, resurrection, and so forth. So anyway, as he speaks as Abraham speaks to him, in verse 30, he calls him Adonai, and also in verse 31, and also in verse 32. There are three places where he's not addressing him by his personal name. He's being very, very respectful, very careful in how he's wording things. Let's go to verse, I guess I'll start in verse 30. Then he said, "Let not the Lord be angry, Adonai, and I will speak. Suppose 30 should be found there." So he said, "I will not do it if I find 30 there." Now, I think the Old King James puts this in all caps, but it is not YHWH. It's the word Adonai. He's being, as I said, very, very respectful here. Nowadays, of course, Jews never use YHWH. When they come to it, they pronounce it Adonai, following Abraham's example, perhaps. And he said, "Indeed, now I have taken it upon myself to speak to the Lord." Once again, Adonai. Suppose 20 should be found there. So he said, "I will not destroy it for the sake of 20." In the Middle East, people haggle. And so Abraham is doing the traditional Middle Eastern haggling here. And then he said, "Let not the Lord be angry," once again Adonai, "but I will speak but once more." And I think you'll find in the Old King James, all these three references are in all caps, even though they are not YHWH, because they're trying to let you know he's speaking to God. Then he said, "Let not the Lord be angry, but I will speak but once more. Suppose 10 should be found there." And he said, "I will not destroy it for the sake of 10. So the Eternal went his way. This is, of course, Yahweh. So the Eternal went his way as soon as he had finished speaking with Abraham, and Abraham returned to his place. And then we have the account of Sodom and Gomorrah, those wicked cities, and how God deals with them. So you see two very important points here. In this chapter, God is merciful, He's patient, but then as you keep reading, the time comes when finally He acts. He will act. So if a nation becomes extremely degenerate, it ultimately begins to self-destruct, and particularly a nation that has accepted a certain responsibility. Quite frankly, the country where I live and where I was born, where my parents were born, and to where my grandparents came to seek refuge more than a century ago, this beloved country really began with a relationship with God, and took that relationship very seriously. And now, unfortunately, I see this country in a state of moral decline, and I understand that God is patient, and I'm grateful for that. God is merciful, I'm grateful for that. But I realize there comes a time when, unless there's repentance, then judgment does come. That's something to certainly be concerned about. Now there's a lot of lessons in this chapter, and I hope that I've shared some important ones with you today as I've gone over it. And it does show, of course, the importance of Abraham as a biblical figure, as a hero of the Bible, as a hero in the history of God's way of life. You want to call it God's religion, God's teachings, God's plan of salvation. And I want to go now to Galatians, the 3rd chapter, in conclusion. And I realize there's a lot I've left unsaid, but I hope that this has been beneficial going over Genesis 18 at this spring season of the year. We're now, as I'm speaking, on the 28th day counting towards the festival of Pentecost. And if any of you are going to be in our area of Central Florida for Pentecost, then let us know. There'll be, we plan to have services, as I said, in the Flair Church. We plan to have services for Pentecost. So if you're in the area, let us know. But I want to go to Galatians 3, and remember this: whatever your background, first of all, physically speaking, we're all descendants of Adam and Eve. We're all part of the human race, so we shouldn't be, hostile to other people of other races and backgrounds. That's inappropriate. But besides that, if we now have a relationship with God through Jesus Christ, we have a tremendous kinship with one another, spiritually speaking. We are the brothers and sisters of Jesus Christ. He's our elder brother. Collectively, the church is the bride of Christ, and we are, spiritually speaking, descendants of Abraham, as we see in Galatians 3 and verse 29. Galatians 3 and 29, verse 29. And if you are Christ, then you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. So as we read Genesis 18 and other parts of the Bible concerning the life of Abraham, we can be grateful that, spiritually speaking, all of us who are Christian commandment keepers, we are Christ and we are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. All the best to you and yours.